Thank you everyone for coming. As Jackie said, my name is Michael Kimmelman. I am the author of Confessions of a Wall Street Insider, and I thought I'd talk for a while and then leave ample time for some Q&A at the end. Before I begin though, can I just see a show of hands? How many people in this audience are FBI agents or prosecutors? Just trying to gauge how friendly the crowd's going to be. We are filming today's event, and since in today's world, if it's not posted on social media, it didn't actually happen, I'm going to go ahead and put that up later in the week. Feel free to share it with others, which means I'll almost certainly get a call from my mom, and while she won't have much to say about the substance of the program, she will for sure want to know why I couldn't at least shave or get a haircut for the event. My journey through the criminal justice system, and my case in particular, was incredible for a whole host of reasons. I obviously won't be able to touch on all of them today, but I do hope to give you a brush of what it was like to go through this nightmare and to come out on the other side, mostly in one piece, albeit with a little less hair and a little more of a libertarian bent politically. What I experienced going through the system, and when I refer to the system, I'm referring to the criminal justice system and the prison system, which are actually two very distinct and unique entities, and that's actually a big part of the problem. But for purposes of simplicity, I'm going to treat them as one today. What I experienced going through the system was an eye-opener, at the least. I grew up in Los Angeles, admittedly with privilege. My parents were the first members of my family to be born in the USA, the first to go to college. I never wanted for food or shelter, and those same parents, when I was 7, gifted me a library card, which is still the greatest gift I've ever received in my life, with the exception of my 3 children. I was a decent student, ended up editor of the Law Review and editor of the Law Review at the University of Southern California Law School, as Jackie said. And schools, note, are always very excited when a formerly incarcerated alumni give them a very public shout out. They love it. So, that's USC, I'm coming for Lafayette later. I then went to work for Sullivan & Cromwell, which is, as Jackie said, one of the better law firms out there. I worked there for several years and then lateraled into finance. So let's cut to the chase. How does a relatively nice Jewish boy from the San Fernando Valley end up in federal prison hanging out with dealers, gangsters, and Aryan grandfathers? Well, for starters, I answered the phone on August 7, 2007. My friend Zvi Goffer, a trader at another firm that I frequently shared trading ideas with, wanted to know how my father-in-law's retirement lunch went. We talked for a while, and then towards the end of the call, he told me something to the effect that he was hearing from his smart money guys, one of them, that thought 3Com was in play, and that he and a tech analyst at his firm considered a high conviction call, and that he was there himself for some size, meaning he was buying a large position. He noted the Wall Street Journal 2 weeks ago had an article that was said more or less the same exact thing. It had the name of the acquirer, the name of the investment bank, and the price. As always, it was swim at your own risk and do your own research, caveat emptor if you chose to buy it. The next day I bought a decent sized position, and for the next 2 months I bought and sold, riding the stock up and down, never received a substantive update from Zvi any different from what he originally told me. 7 weeks later, the stock got taken over by the same exact acquirer and the same exact price as the Journal had, and then more than 2 years later I was arrested for that trade. After my arrest, my attorney attempted to convince the government that its net was too wide in this case, that I didn't belong there. Of the 9 people that were arrested in my case by the government, they conceded that I was, in their own words, substantially very different and, at best, a peripheral player. They acknowledged that I was the only one without a burner phone and the only one who didn't pay any cash bribes. However, they were not willing to drop the case. They said, let him plead guilty to 1 count of conspiracy, no need for him to cooperate, and most importantly, no prison time. So for those of you who play poker, there's a term called pot committed. It means that you've bet so much already that you have to play out the hand, even if strategically it may not be the right move. The feds in my case were pot committed, meaning they had made a huge splash across papers and TV, and to drop my case at that point would have been an embarrassment, and it might have hurt some careers. So rather than do the right thing, they tried to give me what they considered the next fairest option, which was no prison and a small fine. So, did I take the deal? Well, you can probably guess the answer to that one since I'm here talking to you today. Everybody always wants to know why I didn't take the deal. Well, in my mind, it was pretty simple. Because I didn't break the law. And I wasn't going to go get up in front of a judge and perjure myself and say that I knew it was inside information when it wasn't, when I didn't. Don't get me wrong, plenty of people do that, including several in our case. One defendant pled guilty to 3Com and said that he now knows that it was inside info. Well, guess what? That's not the standard. The standard is when you made the trade, not after the fact years later when the FBI can show you detailed calls or testimony that you weren't privy to show the tipping chain and to see that it was illegally acquired. Just to note, that same defendant also pled guilty to insider trading in another stock at the FBI's behest that no one, including the lawyers who pled guilty to leaking inside information, had ever heard of. It was simple coercion and circumstantial timing. Bottom line is, I knew there were potential consequences for standing up for what I believed in, and I was prepared to pay those consequences. Granted, I had an idea that I would be facing somewhere in the 1 to 3 year range. If I was facing 5 or 10 years and they offered me that probation deal, I would have pled guilty to anything they wanted, including, even though I hadn't been born yet. It was a calculated risk. Now, I may have handicapped the odds terribly, but I assumed what I had been taught was true, that the system is an adversarial, objective system where both sides present evidence before a neutral judge, and that a fair and impartial jury of my peers makes a determination based on the evidence. That is what I was taught in law school, and it's the ideal that I hope our justice system lives up to someday. What I didn't realize was that one side wins 97% of the time, and that deep structural biases exist in the system. Would one side win 97% of the time if it was really a level playing field? Would you ever buy tickets to a sporting event where one team wins 97% of the time? Warriors fans, no need to answer that question. By turning down the deal, that meant we were headed for trial. My lawyers thought that would never happen. They looked at the evidence against Zvi. There were 7 informants, 500 hours of phone taps and body wires, and figured he was rational and that he'd have to take a deal. But I knew Zvi by this time, and I knew he had a very distorted version of reality. During pretrial, which lasted almost 2 years, I heard countless times, if he got off, I'm getting off. And while there were parts of the case that were genuinely absurd, you have to remember the timing. This was 2011. The country was broke and justifiably angry. Occupy Wall Street was about to explode in Zuccotti Park, less than 500 yards from the federal courthouse where we were being tried. While on pretrial, the government also employed a handful of dirty tricks to try to pressure and coerce me into pleading guilty. FBI agents stalked and menaced my family when we were out to breakfast or with friends. They eventually shut my bank accounts and my credit cards. And when that didn't work, they shut my wife's business accounts as well. A particularly repulsive move, considering she had nothing to do with the case and at the time was the only one working to help put food on our family's table. So much for the fiction of presumed innocent. Try paying your mortgage in this day and age with a money order from CVS. There were other disturbing incidents, including the government violating privilege over and over by listening to wiretap calls between attorneys and clients, and husbands and wives. Even non-lawyers know that is blatantly illegal under the Constitution. The FBI went a step further and planted a bug in the bedroom between a husband and wife and listened in on intimate personal conversations. In the first case of its kind, the wife, whose civil liberties were violated by the FBI, sued the FBI, and they recently settled her case. The appropriate remedy for such an outrageous violation of privacy in the Constitution should have been to toss the wiretaps out. Judge Sullivan feigned outrage and told the government in a very stern voice that they should not do that again, but he declined to punish or censure the government in any way. As trial got closer, the government actually offered me a deferred prosecution, the legal equivalent of dropping my case, if and only if both of my co-defendants pled guilty. It was a veritable get-out-of-jail-free card. All I needed was a sane co-defendant. I wasn't even close, and as V became more volatile and irrational, I knew unfortunately that we were heading to trial. Before jury selection began, we made a motion to delay the trial a week. Raja Jaratnam, the owner of Galleon, had been convicted that Thursday afternoon. All weekend, the television and newspapers had articles splashed about their papers about Raj, the financial supervillain, and then pictures of us talking about the next Galleon trial coming up this Monday. The jury pool would obviously be biased by the negative press linking us and Raj. Judge Sullivan gave it about 6 seconds of thought and then said denied. No explanation, just that he didn't think it was necessary. The expediency of keeping his calendar straight outweighed any possible delay. When my attorney saw my face fall, he tried to buck me up by noting that almost certainly 4 out of the 5 jurors in our case had never read a newspaper in their lives. If that wasn't disheartening enough, jury selection was a shocking wake-up call. Comments like "no one gets arrested by accident" and "where there's smoke, there's fire" were voiced. Then the judge asked the jury pool, how many people have a negative view of hedge funds or Wall Street? You'd have thought he asked who wants a free iPad the way those hands shot up. After jury selection, my best, if not only chance at acquittal, came right before the trial started when my attorney, in an attempt to break the tension, offered the prosecutor a deal. From where we were seated about 30 yards behind the judge was a giant golden eagle behind his chair emblem. Allow me one throw of the football. If I could hit the eagle, the government would drop the case. If I missed, I would agree to plead guilty on all counts. After watching jury selection, I would have taken that gamble in a heartbeat. But the prosecutor didn't have much of a sense of humor, and he just snarled. So that meant trial. Unless you've been living under a rock, you're familiar with the deep institutional biases that exist for people of color and the poor when faced with dealing with the criminal justice system. Whether it's denial of bail, denial of adequate counsel, or a whole host of other factors, unfortunately, wealth plays a larger role than culpability in the outcome of a defendant's fate. Even in my case, there were hints of this. In the end, I paid a $30,000 disgorgement fine and received a 30-month prison sentence. Phil Mickelson made $1 million on an illicit tip, gave it back, and apologized. He was playing golf at the Masters last week. And we don't have time to talk about the banks who were collectively fined on the order of $400 billion. That's billion with a B. And virtually not a single person went to prison for that. It clearly helps to have political connections in our system. Personally, I bore witness to just a few of the institutional biases that make it difficult to get a fair trial. And keep in mind, I'm an educated white male with the resources to hire an attorney. The overwhelming majority of people who go through our system are not similarly situated. I'm going to give you a quick example from my case just to give you an idea of the environment that a federal defendant faces. One of those biases is fairly subtle, but it's pervasive. In May of 2011, Osama bin Laden was killed in a raid by SEAL Team 6. Like most Americans, I cheered the news while watching TV and excitedly called my close friend up, a former U.S. prosecutor who is now my lawyer, and his sobering response was, "Yeah, no, it's great for everyone. Everyone except bin Laden and you." You see, bin Laden's killing would surely engender chants of USA at Ranger games and a surge of nationalistic pride. And then he reminded me, if I couldn't do the math, it was the United States versus Michael Kimmelman. As someone who was raised on baseball during the height of Ronald Reagan's popularity and the resurgence of American exceptionalism, and who still teared up at the Star-Spangled Banner, it was a devastating realization. And I saw how that factor and symbolism played out at trial. From the American flag pins that the prosecutors wore on their suits, to the giant aforementioned Golden Eagle emblem right behind the judge, who was supposed to be a neutral referee, although they rarely are, and in this particular case and with this particular judge especially, as we would later find out, this was a lot more like Bill Belichick refereeing the Super Bowl while the Patriots were playing. You see, all judges are former prosecutors, and that bias is abundantly clear when making substantive rulings, including how they couch issues and deal with the jury. From the tone they use when talking to the government versus the defendants to where their sympathies lie from years of practice and friendships. Many reforms are needed, but one simple one would be that judges should be required to spend some time as defense attorneys, just to see how the other half lives. That might mute some of the obvious home field bias. 2 quick examples. In my case, when an FBI agent came up to testify as a witness, the judge asked him about the origins of his name, to which he responded Norwegian. The judge replied that he was from Ireland, and they went on to smile and laud the fact that both he and the agent were from the old country. It was a very chummy exchange filled with smiles and warmth done right in front of the jury, right before he testified. And it had the practical effect of the judge validating this witness and letting the jury clearly know that he was one of the good guys. Similarly, during closing arguments by the prosecutors, one of the prosecutors was intentionally misrepresenting the testimony of a government witness named David Slane. I told this witness on tape while trying to recruit him for our firm that we get great information. My attorney asked the same witness on cross-exam, was Kimmelman referring to inside information when he was talking about information, to which the witness replied point blank, no. At closing arguments, the prosecutor said, listen to what he tells David Slane. He tells him we get great information, meaning inside information. It was literally the exact opposite to what the witness testified and a gross distortion of the truth. I had a very quiet exchange with my lawyer to try to prompt him to object. My attorney didn't want to because it's not encouraged to object during closing arguments when the other side is speaking unless it's a very clear issue. I thought this was. Regardless, the judge stopped the closing arguments and proceeded to scold my attorneys and me for being extremely disrespectful and rude to the government, like we were kindergartners. In effect, letting the jury know once again, in case they still weren't clear who the good guys were, that it certainly wasn't us. There were a dozen other bizarre or disturbing incidents at trial, but I'll share just one more to let you know that there were real stakes involved. The government played a tape at trial that featured an individual who was an undercover informant. He was a hedge fund trader who had been approached and coerced into wearing a wire for the better part of 2 years. He was still undercover, married with 3 kids, not unlike myself, and the feds never bothered to give him a heads up or inform him that he was about to be outed as a confidential informant at trial. A reporter picked up on this and wrote a story. That individual, named Ephraim Carpel, found out that his secret was now public by reading the newspaper the next morning in his office. And he hung himself. My attorney was angered and asked one of the prosecutors in court the next morning about it. The prosecutor shrugged and dismissively responded, "It wasn't my witness," before going back to reading his paper. In the end, I was primarily convicted based on that one August 7th call the government didn't even record, where they instructed the jury to speculate that I must have been told about an inside source, even though with nearly 2 years of wiretaps, 7 informants, thousands of instant messages, emails, and body wires, including an FBI informant who sat next to me on the trading desk for almost 2 years, wired up every day. The feds could not point to a single illicit trade or comment. In fact, they didn't even call the informant that sat next to me to testify at trial. Even more mind-blowing, the only witness we called for the defense was the lead FBI case agent. Think about how unusual that is. My attorney asked her a simple question. Can you show me one wiretap, one body wire, one phone call, one email, one instant message where anyone passes Mike Kimmelman inside information and he trades on it? After a few seconds of silence, she reluctantly answered, "No, I can't." In the movies, that's usually the moment when the judge bangs the gavel to quiet the courtroom and orders the case over, cue the happy ending music, reunite with family credits. Perhaps with a different judge, perhaps in a different time, but not here with the public anger so visible and pronounced. Most defendants never get to hear why they were convicted. Juries don't need to explain themselves or offer reasons or rationale for finding someone guilty. We always feared this would be a guilt by association case, which is one of the reasons we tried unsuccessfully to separate my trial from the Goffer brothers. Zvi and his brother were the other 2 co-defendants. The government sat me between the 2 brothers and called us partners and friends dozens of times, yet we still didn't know what the jury's motivation was for reaching their verdict, especially since there wasn't a single piece of credible direct evidence against me on the 3-com trade. What we did know is that on a Wednesday in week 4, after deliberating for several days, the jury asked for a magnifying glass because the print on the trading records was too small and they couldn't read it. Right after this request, Judge Sullivan informed the jury that he was taking a vacation and that court wouldn't be in session for the upcoming Thursday or Friday. The jury, who had already been there for 4 weeks, was visibly upset. Then Monday came. The jury walked in with a verdict first thing in the morning before the bailiffs even had a chance to bring them the requested magnifying glass. I guess in the end, the trading records weren't that important in an insider trading case. I was sentenced to 30 months in prison and 3 more years of supervised release. I would be left to guess why they came back with their verdict of guilty, except for a stroke of luck. 2 days later, my wife Lisa was shopping with our infant son at the local Stop and Shop grocery store. She ran into one of the jurors. My wife was saddened and confused by the outcome, but couldn't pass up the opportunity to ask this juror a question. She politely apologized for disturbing him and said, "Do you mind if I do ask you a question?" And the juror, a white male in his 50s, demurred. She asked, "Why did you vote to convict my husband?" After hemming and hawing a few times, he said, "Well, there were some really bad tapes on that Zvi guy." Lisa said, "I know, but I'm asking about Michael. Why did you convict him?" Well, after hemming and hawing a bit longer, he said, "Well, those tapes were just bad, and why would he be in business with a guy like that?" She didn't try to explain that we weren't partners at the time of the 3Com trade, or that the guilt of one defendant is irrelevant under the law to the guilt of other defendants. She thanked him for his time and walked away. Of course, no good deed goes unpunished, and the juror complained to the FBI and judge that he was menaced and stalked by my wife and wanted her punished. In the first ruling that approached sanity by Judge Sullivan all trial, he refused to hold her in contempt and sentence her to jail time. He was rightfully skeptical that a 6'2", 220-pound male could be menaced or fear from his safety from a 110-pound woman holding an infant in a public grocery store. It was one of the few decisions he made during the course of the trial that turned out to be infallible. It would come out later that this judge was nothing less than a 6-man playing for the government when he allowed the government a lower hurdle to convict by giving incorrect jury instructions that allowed the jury to find me guilty without having to prove a key element of the crime. He literally omitted an entire element. This was the need to find a benefit and knowledge of that benefit on my part. It would be like someone having a few too many drinks, putting their keys in their pocket and walking home, and a judge allowing the jury to find them guilty of DWI if their blood alcohol level was too high. That came back to bite both this judge and the government badly in 3 future cases, where he gave the same incorrect jury instructions at the government's behest, and the appellate court overruled all 3 convictions and gave a very public tongue lashing to Judge Sullivan before allowing those defendants and 6 others to go free. Unfortunately, the wheels of justice grind slowly, and it was too late for me as I had already served my time. My appeal on this issue is still pending. Like the rest of the system, things take time. So, convicted at trial in June meant I wouldn't actually report to prison until the end of the year. Come December, it was time to say goodbye to my family and hello to my new home, Lewisburg Federal Prison. Walking in, I was terrified, yet optimistic. I knew if I played my cards right, I could be home in as little as 2 years. An eternity, but a doable one. My excitement lasted all of 10 minutes before going through the intake process. The first question the administrator asked was the big one that colored my stay. Do you have any issues with your co-defendants? The BOP, that's the Bureau of Prisons, in its infinite wisdom, had put Zvi and his brother in the same prison as me. He was a sociopath, bordering on psychopath by this time, facing those same 7 informants and 500 hours of the most incriminating tapes you've ever heard, including gems like "Don't be the one to go to the big house." Zvi turned down a plea deal that would have had him home in a little over 3 years. Most importantly, they would have allowed the government to drop my case and grant me a deferred prosecution. Zvi was one of the stupidest criminals of all time. The cartoonish tapes make that clear, where he would have a burner phone, then run out of minutes or forget to charge the burner phone, and then call on the regular phone, talking about recharging the burner phone to avoid the feds, who of course were listening. So the stupidest criminal became the stupidest defendant when he turned down that plea deal and went to trial against insurmountable odds and evidence that would have had him home in a little over 3 years versus the 10 years he eventually got sentenced to. So it wasn't much of a stretch for me to imagine that he would be the stupidest inmate of all time, which he also was. I didn't want anyone like that near me, because someone bent on self-destruction, when they explode, they can scorch you if you're anywhere near them. It happened at our firm. It happened at our trial. I didn't want it to happen while we were serving our time. Horror stories abound about someone going into prison for a few months or a few years and coming out much later or not at all. My friend Randy's dad was sentenced to 3 years. While away, broke and unable to defend himself, the government brought charge after charge after charge until he walked out 12 years later. But at least he walked out. between the lack of health care, the violence, the draconian add-on sentences, there are some who never walk out at all. I have several stories of the like, including an inmate we watched go into a diabetic shock and then get beaten senseless for being non-responsive to the guard's instructions to return to his bed. Not all nightmares come while you're sleeping. After intake, which included many of the things you've seen in movies or heard about in popular culture, including the infamous strip down, the spread and cough, the guard proceeded to give me a 5 XXL white t-shirt and a pair of shower shoes because it was lunch and the clothing guy wasn't back till 1 p.m. Told me to go get lunch. Walking into a crowded lunch hall wearing a t-shirt that was down to my knees, shower slippers, and khakis has to be the most vulnerable and out of place I've ever felt. Seeing the clientele as well wasn't exactly comforting. One white inmate noticed my deer-in-the-headlights look and asked me, "Hey, did your lawyer lie to you too and tell you this was a white-collar prison?" Lewisburg is considered a minimum security, or as it's commonly known, a camp, and it's attached to a maximum security penitentiary where they put the more dangerous inmates. After lunch, back for the rest of intake, the administrator asked me if I was planned on behaving while I was there. I nodded that I did, although I wondered to myself were there actually inmates who answered that question no, and if they did, what happened to them? He must have been reading my mind because he responded, "Good. Because if you don't, I'll send you up there. And you know what's up there," he said, pointing in the direction of the penitentiary. I actually didn't know what was up there, so he explained it to me very clearly. You see, up there, that's a gladiator school. We pull people out of there with holes in them every week. During my stay, ambulances would show up there on the regular, and the entire prison would be put on lockdown more than once for a murder investigation while I was there. After we got that over with, it was time for me to get my bunk assignment. At this point, I had my poker face on because I felt that anything I reacted to might get me sent somewhere worse than the place I was at, which was definitely the scariest place I had ever been. He looked through a large, old-fashioned bookkeeper manual and he said with a snicker, "I'll tell you what, I'm going to put you with a couple of drug-dealing N-words." Of course, he didn't say N-word. "That'll be a good introduction to prison life for a gentle flower like yourself." I didn't react other than to try to conceal the fear that I wasn't dealing with a totally rational person and that this guy was in charge and had my fate in his hands. When I didn't flinch, he said, "Don't worry, I'll put you with your own kind in a little bit." My own kind? What kind did he mean? The kind that like to read the Wall Street Journal and listen to NPR? More likely he meant the meth-dealing bikers. Needless to say, discretion was the better part of valor and I didn't ask for clarification. Lewisburg was in the middle of Pennsylvania, or Pennsyltucky as it was known to the inmates to convey the redneck aspect of the guards. At Lewisburg I was the right color, which was often denoted by a point or tap on the forearm, a simple motion which conveyed from guard and inmate alike that you're white, no need to say anything else. That reality would be flipped on my head when I went to a Bronx halfway house and had young black men and women running my life. But in Pennsylvania, I was white. Not real white, of course, because I was Jewish, but still an upgrade from black or brown in the eyes of the guards. I still occasionally got comments like, "I wish we had gas in the showers for you Jews," from some of the more unhappy or sadistic guards, but for the most part I was left alone. I could tell you several dozen prison stories, most of them sad, some broken up by moments of humor or levity, but what prison is mostly about is monotony. They call it doing time because time is really all there is. In prison there's a scarcity of almost everything. Of food, of decency, of privacy, but the one thing there's an endless amount of is time. It's nothing new, and I'm sure you've heard the old complaints. No resources, no food, no health care, overcrowding. To give you an idea, the last place I was at was the size of a basketball court, and there were bunk beds lined up 3 feet from each other. 150 people or so in that space. You could smack the person sleeping to the left of you and to the right of you without ever leaving your bunk. If you're not familiar with the stats, the U.S. incarcerates a greater proportion of its citizenry than any other country. That's us in red. From 300,000 in the 1970s to today, there are over 2 million Americans now in jail or prison. Another 5 million or so on probation or parole. And millions more are off probation, but living with the stigma of being a convicted felon. That stigma is one of the primary reasons we have a national recidivism rate of approximately 65%. Nearly 2 out of 3 people who leave prison will return to being incarcerated in 5 years. A convicted felon is a downhill spiral that, once labeled, substantially removes the ability to get employment, licenses, education, housing, any number of critical things that you and I, or at least I, once took for granted. Removing these makes it likely by a factor of 10 that a formerly incarcerated person will go back to prison, all at a tremendous financial and social cost to himself, his family, and society at large. It is a vicious cycle that makes us less safe, less decent, and poorer as a country. Real solutions are needed, not overly punitive life sentences. And let's be real, they are life sentences in many cases. In the age of Google, in the age of big data, when a background check is a keystroke away, in a system that doesn't differentiate between violent crimes like murder and rape, which is why we originally built prisons, versus getting caught with drugs or tax evasion, or one lapse in judgment as a youth or even an adult. Distinctions that can end a life, not literally, but for all practical purposes. After experiencing what I did, I've maintained since my release that the American people would not tolerate the system if they understood it, or if they could see it with their own eyes. There is a reason they don't allow cameras in federal prison. If the average person saw the barbarism and sheer stupidity, they would demand common sense, real-world solutions. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying people convicted of a crime don't deserve to be punished. They do. But there has to be some practical distinction between a guy caught smoking a joint and someone who murders or rapes an innocent victim. And either way, it can't all be punitive. There has to be some rehabilitative or educational aspect, or we will continue to turn the prison system into a vicious rinse cycle of repeat offenders. And from what I saw, there is almost nothing rehabilitative or educational at all. Literally nothing designed to make people into better citizens or make their reentry into society easier so they are less likely to come back. At Lewisburg, I asked the administration if I could teach a class on interviewing, resume writing, financial literacy, basic skills that would help inmates once they hit the streets, especially the ones that have been locked up for more than a decade. The answer was callous. We like them just the way they are, dumb, more likely to come back to us. It is a de facto vicious cycle of failure by design. Post-release, petty infractions and crimes land many people back. Unpaid parking tickets or child support, failure to adhere to arbitrary instructions from a probation officer. In my case, one of the defendants took some of his wife's cough medicine to help a persistent hacking cough. He had just been released after serving a 5-year sentence away from his wife and 2 kids. Turned out it had codeine in it, which landed him back in prison for 12 months. In the end, our criminal justice system is addressing the symptoms rather than the causes of the problems. And the biggest cause that exists is substance abuse and addiction. Without a doubt, this is why most people are in prison or commit crimes. Again, what's needed is some common sense and some sympathy. Start treating addiction as a mental health issue, as a real healthcare issue, and stop treating it as a crime. People need help. All they get is punishment. 1 in 9 people receive help for addiction. As Dr. Michael Botticelli, an Obama drug policy czar, noted, this makes no sense. People with other diseases get treatment. If you have cancer or diabetes, you receive treatment. A heart attack, you get emergency care. Left untreated, the consequences of addiction are just as devastating, and it usually takes one of 2 things to receive help: death or incarceration. And with the former, there's no coming back. And the cost of incarceration and punishment are 50 times what they could be if we intervened earlier and treated this as a chronic sickness like it is, rather than trying to arrest our way out of the problem. A policy which has failed by any metric, be it financial, social, or moral. I walked out of prison 15 months later and then had to do 6 months in a Bronx halfway house. Do you know the only thing worse than a Bronx halfway house? Prison. But to me it was a huge step up because I could see my family again regularly, eat real food, and begin the process of coming back to the real world. People constantly ask me, how could I come out of that experience? From losing my fund, my career, my reputation, my marriage, most importantly my liberty and my freedom, and still be smiling? Well, if you're not smiling when you walk out of prison, you're probably going right back in. But in all seriousness, I believe our experiences are what make us who we are. And there were things that happened to me during this experience, like getting sober, like realizing what was important in my life, and being truly grateful for what I have, and for the people that I met while I was inside, that I wouldn't change. And I believe it will be a blessing in the long run. In prison, there's a very common refrain that everything happens for a reason. I don't believe that, but I do believe that everything happens provides an opportunity. I also believe in second chances. I hope you do too, and I hope you are willing to keep an open mind and that we continue this conversation another time. Thank you. Well, we don't have a microphone, so you'll have to enunciate if you have questions, but we'll just fire away. Go ahead.
Is there a movement of white-collar criminals, or people who have been convicted, not criminals, they were falsely convicted, are they banding together and articulating some of the weaknesses or perversions of the system so that all of us understand better? You have the tools are intellectual, you have the experience, and you have some organizational skills that made you successful in your private life. So why don't we see that?
That's a good question. I don't think there is an organized movement. I think it's been, asymmetrical to some degree. It is notable, though, and this is fairly cynical, that now with the expansion and criminalization of a lot of other things and more people going through the system, that people are articulating about some of the unfairness and some of the problems in the system and issues that people hope to address. Frankly, when it was young black kids going through the system, nobody gave a crap. So now that there are people going through it that do have more access to resources and possibly a little bit greater of a platform, people are, lobbying for reform. And we've seen a lot of that in the last few years, and there have been some inroads as well, but there's nothing organized. But there are some very good groups like Van Jones's group out there or Just Leadership USA that are trying to cut the prison population by 50%, which is a very realistic number. If you think about in the 70s, there were 300,000 people. Now there's over 2 million people, not counting the 5 on probation and everything else. I mean, that's growth that, defies population or any other type of growth. So.
What kind of employment problems did you find when you came out, and where are you working now?
So I came out with a fairly realistic image of what I was able to do when I came out, so I didn't waste a ton of time turning my resume into Goldman Sachs or anywhere else. I mean, I'm banned from registering with a firm to trade. I was given offers to manage portfolios and to consultant portfolios, so you can do things privately. I chose to get out of the business entirely, but a normal person going out of the system encounters tremendous hurdles. Like I said, that background check is devastating. It's a scarlet letter. New York has made some good progress in, people used to not be able to cut hair or get a barber license. I still think they can't, but there are a whole host of positions that are off limits, so to speak, which shouldn't be, obviously, And again, it's important to differentiate. If you have a violent crime that you've been convicted of and there's a community safety, measure to it, that's a different story. But for, non-violent, first-time offenders, I don't care if it's drugs or white collar or whatnot, to have them, prohibited from rent or a mortgage or bank accounts. I was just able to get a bank account last year. I mean, I literally still couldn't get a bank account. I was on a financial no-fly list. So, and right now I'm doing a whole host of things. I'm doing some coaching and speaking. Targeting real estate investment opportunities for a group, mostly in the Southeast, and several other things. But it's all entrepreneurial. It's all outside of a formal, S&P 500, Fortune 500 company, which I think almost certainly I wouldn't have a chance at.
Now that you've served your sentence, have you regained all of your rights to vote and so forth and so on?
Yes and no, and it's a state-by-state calculus. So New York, again, is fairly progressive. I have gotten back the right to vote in New York. In Alabama, any conviction removes that right permanently, so something like 36% of African Americans don't have the right to vote anymore in Alabama. So it's a disenfranchisement that we haven't seen on a scale like that in a long time. I can't own a firearm, which, you know, the Larchmont Police Department actually still has my shotgun that I used to have in my house. And there are a whole host of other rights that I still don't have and may never have. So it's really a state-by-state dependent, but federal law, if, you know, if I went to, like I used to take, you know, my daughter shooting archery over on Boston Post Road, if there was a picture of me doing that, I would go back to prison for 5 years. Just a picture, and I'm off probation right now. I can't buy pepper spray, you know, bear mace. There's a whole host of things that I cannot buy or even be seen with without being in violation of federal law.
I'm sorry, I can't remember. What were you charged with by the feds?
It was it was securities fraud is the actual name of the charge. It's colloquially insider trading, and I was charged substantively with a 3-comp trade and then with conspiracy, which is like a catch-all that they charge everyone with.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you for being here and for your candor. I'd like to go back to the trial for a second.
Yep.
Was there any, you didn't testify.
I didn't.
Could you tell us
Yeah.
about the process that led to that conclusion?
Sure.
Because it sounds like the deck was stacked against you and you almost had nothing to lose if you decide to testify.
So it's always tricky, and the defender's standard playbook is that you never get on the stand or put your client on the stand if you think you're winning. Unless you're losing badly, because there's too many uncertainties that could happen. You know, just from a practical point of view, these are things that happened 3-4 years ago. They could ask you about a date, and if you don't remember that date, you know, they'd say, you made 50 grand on that date. How could you not remember? You know, and then look at the jury and smirk. So it's a tough decision whether to testify or not. I wanted to. My attorneys felt at no point were we losing at trial. But they were also operating under the metric, you know, that the government has a burden of proof to prove the charges. That's not reality anymore. It certainly wasn't in 2011. Maybe in 1999 when everybody was rich and getting richer or whatnot, that burden of proof was a little more real. In this case, it was literally from jury selection, you know, with the negative comments about Wall Street, hedge funds, finance. With an angry, you know, population, I had to come up with an alternative narrative, and I should have gotten on the stand if I wanted to have a chance, I think. But again, my attorneys thought, you know, on 3Com, they didn't present anything that was credible. It was all circumstantial. V traded it, I traded it and made money, and that was it. They said that can't be the basis for a conviction under our law, but it was.
Who was your counsel?
It was Wilson Cincini.
How did you spend your days in prison? You know, how did you
Sure.
pass the time? Did you write, were you able to write there?
I wrote about 800 pages.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's funny because I walked over there. I started this book a lot in the basement right here while I was waiting to go to prison, just because there were so many things that came up in pretrial or trial that I found just mind-blowing that I had to start writing it down, or I probably would have gone more insane. But then in prison I wrote, you know, you just try to find ways. There's companionship and fellowship. They had a track that you could walk the track. So, you know, you do a lot of time walking the track and talking. The track was a mixed bag because you could hear and see the penitentiary that was right there. And you could literally hear the screams of pain all day, like coming from the penitentiary. So, you know, you try to just block it out, or eventually while I was there, we were able to get headphones and, you know, radios.
Did they have any kind of counseling?
In prison?
Prepare you to, no, I guess.
To get in, or once I was there?
No, once you were there. Or even.
I mean, they have technical people who are counselors. I had a drug counselor and another counselor, but, you know, they're cops. And I'm not demeaning cops. They are people who are counselors, but if you tell them something, they can use that against you and can hurt you, you know, time-wise, or take away good behavior, or give you what's called a shot, which is like, you know, a demerit that could extend your time or take away privileges.
Two things. One, was there a library at the prison
There was.
that you could use?
A library. She asked, is there a library at the prison? Again, the size of from here to there, and it was based on all inmate books that they had donated. So as an inmate,
No legal,
yeah, I mean, there is legal, they have legal books, but it's inadequate. And I did a lot of jailhouse, you know, unauthorized practice of law while I was there. because I had been disbarred before I went.
The other
But-
thing is that were your attorneys assigned the judge? Was it strictly a matter of luck or?
No, and that's a very complicated and disturbing topic in that this Judge Sullivan, who has now been overruled multiple times, was actually friendly with Preet Bharara, and they knew that he had this lower standard that he was allowing the government to use to convict people. And somehow there's something like 48 district court judges. This guy heard an overwhelming number of cases, which would have been like 6 million to 1, that it would have been random. And they are supposed to spin a wooden wheel. That's how it used to work. And they did say they spun the wheel and he came up, but whoever was spinning that wheel should come with me to Vegas because we could kill it. Go ahead.
You mentioned that they froze your bank accounts and your wife's bank accounts. So does that mean you had no access to any money while you were in jail? If so, how do you pay your attorney?
So I had paid in advance some. They didn't freeze my accounts, they shut the accounts. So some of it was frozen at the firm level, which I had capital at. But like my wife's business, she is a caterer, they just shut the account. So you no longer have access and they tell you, hey, take it somewhere else. But you're on that, it was a deliberate move by the government to put pressure on me to plead
How
guilty.
did you get it back? How did you get
It took a long time and it was very tough and it hurt her business. She bounced checks to vendors and I had no access to do anything, so.
Is the law clear on exactly what insider trading is? Did you know this, as all your colleagues must have known, and exactly what was done that was wrong?
Okay, that's a great question. Insider trading has never been statutorily defined. It is a patchwork of judge-made law, and as we've seen in my case and others, some of those judges disagreed on what the actual law was. So there is a large gray area, but it's basically material, non-public information that you acquire in breach of a fiduciary duty, with full knowledge and a benefit that is exchanged. Recently, there's been 2 cases, the Newman case in the Second Circuit, that overturned a lot of the cases because they didn't prove all of those elements. This was the case that overruled Judge Sullivan. And then there was another Supreme Court case to decide what kind of benefit and how close a relationship must we have. But Congress has never defined it. Congress, theoretically, in 2012, didn't say that the insider trading laws, they waited until 2012 to actually say that they applied to Congress. They passed something called the Stock Act that finally said, hey, this applies to us as well. And if you look at congressional portfolios, they outperform the market by about 600 basis points, which, as any active manager knows, is almost impossible over a long term. So, there is a lot of shady practice going on, we'll put it that way, or endemic corruption in Congress. But, go ahead.
Was there ever an opportunity to play the SEC versus, justice saying, hey, this is a criminal case?
Good question.
How did that work?
We actually, and that's one of the things that obviously bothered me, is I was arrested and dragged out of my house without being asked a simple, one single question first. And then even if they did drop my case, at that point, your front page, CNBC and Wall Street Journal, and then it's B24, the tiny paragraph that says, whoops, we made a mistake with that guy. It would have been fair and it would have been more just had the SEC or the DOJ said, come in, we think you're guilty of X. We're going to talk to you about that, and unless you can prove otherwise or convince us, then we're going to arrest and indict you. So that would have at least given me the opportunity to explain to them some of the mistakes that they had in the criminal complaint, and there were a lot of them, as well as they didn't need to terrorize my family, at 5 a.m. and put the dogs in there and pull me out of there. So, but the practical answer is careerism plays a huge role. So nobody's going to give up a case against Raj that could make your net worth in private practice times 3 to the SEC and hand that off. So it's you want to be the main guy prosecuting that case. They would never turn it over to the SEC.
Was the knock on the door the first time that you had no idea, literally when they knocked on your door, they never sent you a letter?
Nothing.
Never sent you a question?
Nothing at all. And again, but for the fact that Raj had been arrested 2 weeks earlier, it would have been, 10 times the surprise. But the fact that Raj was arrested, my former partner Zvi worked directly for Raj, He was Raj's, right-hand man. When Raj got arrested, when they arrest you, they do a criminal complaint, which is a public document you can read. And there was a stock on that Hilton that I had traded, Ed Zv's recommendation, that Raj was being charged with as well. So I thought there was a chance that Zvi would be questioned by the SEC or that our firm would be investigated. Never thought personally I would have any liability, but when that knock on the door came and the FBI was there, I assumed it was about Raj and Hilton and or the firm, and they never ended up actually charging me with Hilton. So.
Could you explain, you had mentioned that your conviction has been appealed, yet you served your sentence.
Yeah.
Isn't that backward? Shouldn't you wait for the result of the appeal?
In an ideal world, absolutely. But justice, it goes incredibly slowly. I mean, I was on pretrial for 2 years. We're all used to an episode of Law and Order where in 42 minutes somebody gets arrested, the trial happens, and they serve their time, or it gets completed. This was a forever type of thing. It was 2 years till trial. Trial was forever, and then another 6 months till I went to prison. 15 months Lewisburg, 6 months Bronx halfway house, 3 years of supervised release. So it is a long process. In some cases, you can get bail pending appeal, meaning you don't report to prison until after your case is heard. In my case, I got 3 young kids. I didn't want to put this off forever. After having been through the trial and seen the stuff I saw, I was extremely cynical and felt that this was just, sort of a whitewash, and I was going to get taken away no matter what. So I wanted to get it done with. But again, the appeal is still now ongoing because it's just taken, in 2014, we made a secondary appeal. I lost on direct appeal. It was before the Newman case came out. The Newman case said that my particular judge screwed up. Wrong jury instructions, omitted an element of the crime. So we then appealed back to it has to go back to the judge. So it went to Judge Sullivan, and we were literally asking him to overrule himself, which, as you can imagine, judges don't love to do. And he actually sat on the motion for 2 years, just didn't rule on it or do anything. So, the good news is he recently just denied it. It's not good that he denied it, but we expected him to deny it after everything else he's done. And now it goes to the Second Circuit, where hopefully it gets a fair hearing.
Can individuals charged with a crime get the same kind of representation from criminal lawyers that they might get from lawyers who can earn more money?
I think what you're asking is, does your average person have access to decent counsel, or do the wealthy have, obviously, their pick of... Yeah, I mean, it's you've heard of the term rich man's justice. That exists here and everywhere else as well. I mean, Raj spent $50 million on lawyers. I know people who can't afford, it's tremendously expensive. I spent $150th of that, and it still bankrupted me. Your average person doesn't have the ability to write a check for $250 or $500 grand to go to trial. So he's either stuck with a federal defender, who a lot of them are extremely competent, but they have such overwhelming caseloads that they have to move it forward, and judges aren't sympathetic either. So it's, boom, boom, boom. And I can't tell you how many cases I helped out on in prison where I would look at somebody's habeas motion and, say, well, look, you had a gun, and the kid would say, what do you mean? I didn't have a gun. He's like, well, here's your plea agreement. You had a gun. He's like, my lawyer just told me to sign this. And a gun's 5 more years. So it's not a great system, to put it mildly.
When you win the appeal,
Yeah.
what do you get? Other than I won the
Right.
appeal.
I get to go to Disneyland. No, it's reputational redemption more than anything else. It's not going to change my life. I still was taken from my kids and served that time. Still had to go through the entire process. And like I said, in the age of Google, even if I win, I'm not going to go give my resume to Blackstone or somebody else. You're still going to have to make ends meet on your own and figure out what you want to do, which again these days is easier than ever because it is becoming much more of an entrepreneurial society, but at the same time it's not going to change anything other than I feel it'll be the just outcome and reputational redemption.
Is that judge still judging?
Oh yeah, oh yeah,
Really?
oh yeah.
And another question, these private jail prisons that they have, do we have a lot of them in New York?
I don't know about New
I know
York
in
in
the South,
general.
They seem to love them because it's a money-making.
Yeah.
So therefore, can we get rid of those, or do we need these things, or is it?
There was a
manufactured?
movement under President Obama to start cutting it back, but I think that has stalled a little bit. There are private halfway houses, and the ones, I can only speak to the one I was in and to the others that I knew, friends that were in, and they're a disgrace. I mean, they're absolutely mind-boggling, the stuff you would see. I mean, talking about one payphone, you know, 5 floors of just, you know, people packed in together. And, you know, even if you have a job or want to go interview, you got to wait in line for the payphone, and somebody's got to call you on the payphone when there's 25 other, you know, formerly incarcerated people lined up to talk to their girlfriend or whoever. And then you have to get a message, and then you have to give them a 48-hour notice. So they make it, it almost functions as the exact opposite of what it's intended to do, which is to facilitate re-entry in a relatively painless way. The good news is I think there are some changes being made. I mean, you used to not be able to have a cell phone. Obviously, you can't do a resume because there's no computers. So, you know, it's basically a prison outside of prison. And it's run by, again, people who, there's no incentives to do the right thing. So there it would be, you know, kids would try to reverse bribe me saying, hey, you know, if you want to pee dirty, give me $500 and you can do that. And then eventually, if you know they didn't like you or you weren't willing to play that game, it would be give me 500 or I'm going to say you pissed dirty. So, and again, if you did something like that, you go back to prison for a year, sometimes 18 months. So it's a tough system.
It sounds like you're also indicting the jury system.
I mean, I don't want to do that, but at the same time, you know, if you think our educational system has produced a literate, you know, intelligent citizenry that are active and involved and understand, you know, this isn't that's not the only criticism. Obviously, murder cases, a bar fight, people understand that. Insider trading, there are 4 or 5 elements, and again, judges, lawyers, and everybody else who are supposed to know this stuff cold fought over it for 18 months or 10 years or 20 years now, and they still can't decide what the right law is. So how do you expect a juror who has no experience whatsoever in the system to understand it, especially when you think about, you know, the judge reads the jury instructions to the jury, and they're 87 pages. I mean, could you remember anything or be well-versed in anything that's read to you that long? I mean, I could barely remember what the flight attendant tells me, you know, 30 seconds after she does her little spiel. So it's a tough system. Certain cases like patent law, perhaps some of the financial crimes, you know, probably are better heard by a judge or a 3-judge panel than laymen. But, you know, jurors slept in my case. You know, there was a prison guard who was on the jury who showed up, eyes bloodshot, you know, every morning because he was out partying because he wasn't working. And, you know, there were multiple others who were just unfit to serve, in my opinion. And again, it was my life, so I cared about it. For them, it was a, you know, 3-week vacation.
Take one more question.
Hi, last one.
No, yeah, I just wanted to, it sounds like it was violent inside.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree that there was an overall feeling of imminent violence?
It's very
danger?
tribal, and it's not quite like that. On a camp level, there is a no violence policy. It is a strict no violence policy. That doesn't mean there's no violence. That means if a guard sees it, then you get bumped up to either a low, you know, first you go to solitary, but then you get bumped up to a low or a medium, and that's where you start to be sexually assaulted, and the violence is real as well. So the camp, there wasn't a lot, but it's also an unfair policy. Like I had my co-defendants there, and one of them stepped to me several times and wanted to hurt me, and life is cheap. You could pay people a small amount of money to put someone in the hospital or hurt them. Had he jumped me, like he tried, and if he marked me, even if I didn't do anything, if he sucker punched me or jumped me and I had marks on me, and we got called in and had to strip a couple times because they thought something happened, you know, people were chattering. If I had marks on me, then I go, you know, even if I did nothing. So it's a tough sort of system again.
What kind of lawyer were you when you were a lawyer?
I was a corporate M&A lawyer, and I did some real estate work as well.